You're listening to Non-Toxic. I'm your host, Daniel Penny. By now, you know the drill. The plastic containers you microwaved your leftovers in, the beat-up nonstick pan, the PFAS coating on your favorite hiking jacket. Throughout Just Keep Swimming, we've been connecting the dots between the chemicals hiding in everyday life and what they're doing to male fertility. And it's not looking good. In episode 1, you heard from Felix van der Heijden, the steroid-injecting Dutch looksmaxer who decided to let his fertility drop for the sake of his gains. I met him when I was reporting my sperm racing piece for the New York Times Magazine. Then we went deep with the researchers at Silent Spring Institute on what endocrine-disrupting chemicals actually are and what they do to sperm, and why a lot of that damage happens before you're even born. If you haven't listened yet, go back and start there. Last time, we went into your closet with Ben Mead of Oikotex, and we broke down the azo dyes and the heavy metals hiding in your clothes and how they make their way into your body through your skin. This week, I wanted to zoom out, because understanding what EDCs do to your body is one thing. Understanding how we got here, why these chemicals are in our products in the first place, and why the regulatory system has failed to keep us safe from them, that's a different conversation. So I called Lindsay Dahl.
You've got a noisy but small fringe that just kind of want to paint this as a woman's issue. And there's like a pettiness in the way that's delivered to kind of downplay this as like, oh, this is about mascara. This is about makeup. And it's really not. This is about human health.
She's spent 20 years as an environmental health advocate and lobbyist, and she's helped pass over 30 state and federal laws restricting toxic chemicals. Now she's the chief impact officer at Ritual. Lindsay also wrote Cleaning House, which is out now in hardback from Day Street, and she runs a Substack I absolutely recommend for anyone interested in this topic, called The Environmental Health Brief. Lindsay is the person who knows why the system is broken and what it would take to actually fix it. This is Just Keep Swimming. Let's get into it. It's a pleasure to have you on Non-Toxic, Lindsay. Thanks so much for making the time. Today, who are you? You're not a doctor. You're not a toxicologist or an engineer. So how did you become an expert in chemical exposure, and what was your path into this field?
Yeah, important topic and timely. I'm excited to get into it.
Okay. As you noted, I'm not a scientist, a PhD scientist. I've worked for 20 years as an environmental health advocate. So working both within the kind of public policy, environmental and public health nonprofit, and more recently within the four walls of corporate America to help kind of operationalize and push us away as an overall economy away from toxic chemicals.
When you were starting your career, this is in the early 2000s, I think of that as the boom time for green consumerism. And there was a real optimistic mood in the air. Like, if we just buy bamboo sheets and hybrid cars, like, it's all going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I imagine your perspective has shifted somewhat since your career began.
Yeah, it like almost makes me a little nostalgic hearing you say that. It's true. There was a like, hey, we can shop our way out of this problem type mentality. And that's one of the things I write about a lot, which is number one, this issue of toxic chemical pollution or plastic pollution. All these things have been placed on our shoulders to kind of shop our way out of. And it's a part of the solution, but it's certainly not the biggest lever we have. And I also think it's unjust to put another thing on someone's shoulders when really the failure and the pressure should be on our elected officials to pass laws that hold chemical companies accountable. And the burden should really be on the chemical industry to prove that their products are safe, both from an environmental and human health perspective, long before they enter the market.
Talk a little bit about some of these chemicals. I think unless someone is deeply conspiratorial, it's clear that chemical companies aren't intentionally trying to poison us or lower global fertility. It's really that these molecules are useful for various industrial purposes. And while they carry certain risks to human health, they just kind of push those to the side, or they're downplayed, or they're purposefully just don't do the research to determine what those risks So, what are the chemicals that you have become interested in beyond things like asbestos or air pollution? Why are they used in our products if it's not just a nefarious plot to poison us? And what are the limitations of the research that have been done on those things?
So, if you think back to post World War II, it was a time where innovation was booming in the United States in particular, and the chemical industry was creating a lot of incredibly helpful, useful materials. Everything from Teflon for our pots and pans to plastics, storage containers. A lot of these products were being marketed at the time to moms and women who were trying to find ways to make their lives a little bit easier, managing and juggling all the expectations that society had at the time. Better living through chemistry, the origins of those like taglines that still ring true in some ways today. And at the time, it was we didn't have any sort of federal oversight over the safety of chemicals. Fast forward to the 1970s, we've got the environmental movement on the heels of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which really looked at pesticides and the impacts we didn't really anticipate with pesticides and things like DDT and Agent Orange. And the time there was a real issue of toxic chemical pollution, like point source pollution directly from these manufacturing facilities into the waterways of these communities where American workers were exposed and those living around them. And so we passed a federal law that was designed to regulate toxic chemicals, but it was deeply flawed. And it grandfathered in all the 62,000 chemicals on the market and was like, oh, we'll review any of those for safety after 1976. But the law was so ineffective that the EPA tried to ban asbestos and they couldn't. So at the end of the day, not all chemicals are bad. And the chemical industry and lots of influencers online want to remind us of that every day. But they're not all safe either. And so we don't have a federal system that really screens chemicals for safety before they enter into the market. In some cases, and in most cases, it's simply a question of the chemical industry of the 1950s through the 1980s didn't ask questions about safety and they made assumptions about chemicals staying in the consumer products. We now have a ton of peer reviewed research that shows that not all chemicals are safe. Some, in fact, are hazardous. And they also migrate out of our products and into our bodies at levels that are linked to harm in peer reviewed research. So I think what gets complicated, but it often gets lost in the noise of social media, which tries to overly distill things into 30-second reels and TikToks. But we're really concerned about priority classes of chemicals. So we're talking about research that goes back to the 1930s that shows certain classes of chemicals behave in ways that are problematic. Endocrine disrupting chemicals are one of them. The second would be those that are called persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. They're the ones that stick around. So some pesticides, PFAS, flame retardants, those are under that category of PBTs. And those are the types of exposures where we really want to ban those certain chemicals outright because we know that companies can make products without these problematic chemicals. Yes, they are useful, but we also know that you can have cleaner, safer, toxic products as well.
So the idea that it's either we go back to the Stone Ages or we just accept that these toxic chemicals are a part of modern life, would you say that's a false choice?
It's absolutely a false choice. It's one that I've heard a lot when I've been lobbying to try to ban these toxic chemicals. I helped pass the nation's first ban on BPA in baby bottles, for example, a known hormone disrupting compound. All the chemical industry was saying was, oh my gosh, there's not going to be any baby bottles on the shelves. Like moms are going to go to the store and not be able to feed their babies. It was like
Think of the
everything is going
children.
to, yeah, same for banning flame retardants from couches. They used a children's burn victim unit to testify in support of these toxic chemicals, even though they do not slow the spread of fires. Like the narratives around this false choice is just not the case. And guess what? The chemical industry that is, yes, making these problematic chemicals, they're also the ones that have the most skin in the game for making the safer alternatives. And they mostly are. So it's not like there's a market upside for them as well. It's just easier to continue to crank out the chemicals that they've been making for decades.
Okay, so we talked about baby bottles. How else are these chemicals winding up in our bodies? What is the process for exposure? You said earlier that scientists and manufacturers didn't realize the extent to which some of these toxic additives or things like plasticizers were migrating out of the product into our bodies Walk me through what those pathways are.
Yep. The pathways vary based on the chemical, product, and individual. But typically, there's a few different ways that we're exposed to toxic chemicals, either through ingesting them, maybe it's through our drinking water, or if we're eating foods that are packaged in different packaging that contains things like phthalates or bisphenols that kind of leach into the foods. Another meaningful route of exposure that I was highly skeptical of is through inhalation. So, example, toxic flame retardants actually have been shown to migrate from our couches or mattresses and end up in household dust. And that seems like the smallest, most innocuous exposure. But given the high level of persistence and toxicity of these compounds, there's been a bunch of biomonitoring studies that have shown when either people switch their couches out to see a dramatic drop in these persistent chemicals, which is hard to do for something that's persistent. And certainly they see reduced exposure for children who have increased behaviors that get dust into their bodies at higher rates than adults do, crawling on the floor, sticking their fingers in their mouths, all these types of things. And then there's also dermal exposure as well, which is I would say your skin actually does a good job of protecting your body. There is still exposure that happens. But these different exposure pathways basically show us, and the biomonitoring research I talked about, when scientists have taken away certain types of products and you can see the drop in chemicals over a short span of time, really shows us that our day-to-day exposures in our home are meaningful. And at the end of the day, if you've got the option to buy two products, you've got a cologne that has phthalates, you have a cologne that doesn't have phthalates, most people, if they're the same price, are going to choose the one that is phthalate free.
But how do you
For
know
me,
which
it
one
feels
has
like a no-brainer.
phthalates?
That's the problem. Like, we've got very few companies, especially in the fragrance and personal care industry, are fully disclosing fragrance ingredients. There's a federal loophole for fragrance on personal care products where it's hiding behind the label, fragrance or parfum. In today's world, the companies that are smart are ones that have moved away from things like phthalates, which help bind the fragrance to our clothing or our skin. But it's really kind of the Wild West still, 20 years after many people have been working on this issue. But I will say there has been a lot of really good movement at both the state level and through some companies who are being more transparent in the ingredients that they use, because they know that that's something that today's consumers really value.
You've been on the front lines of this fight, helping pass 30 state and federal laws. Is that right? From
That's
a
right.
regulatory standpoint, what's supposed to happen when a chemical is proven to be linked to cancer or birth defects or decreased fertility? And why does it feel like these restrictions don't seem to really change what's actually in our environments or in our bodies?
In a perfect world, if I could wave a magic wand, if a chemical is proven to have any sort of harmful health endpoint, like cancer, harming the developing brain, it should be banned. And that's really pretty simple in my mind. If you look at the kind of overall population decline of lead in our bodies and children's bodies after we banned lead from gasoline and paint, it's really dramatic how powerful these federal public health protective laws are. I don't think a chemical company should be able to sell a product if it's linked to harm, given how ubiquitous these products, really given the fact that they migrate up into places like the northern Arctic, communities up in Alaska and Canada. So I think that's what should happen. What I will say is that law I referenced from the 1970s, that was well intended, but did very little to protect us. A bunch of us, thousands of individuals and hundreds of organizations helped pass an update to make that law stronger in 2016. It's called the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA for short. And those changes actually really helped fix some of the fundamental flaws. So if you remember, the EPA couldn't ban asbestos. The EPA has since banned asbestos since we did those updates. And things like trichloroethylene, TCE, is maybe something that's familiar, or PERC, a dry cleaning agent that's highly toxic. Under this updated law since 2016, the EPA has been able to move to regulate some of these toxic compounds. Same with PFAS in drinking water. Unfortunately, in the last 15 months, over 20 different laws related to chemical safety have been rolled back at the federal level. And TSCA, the one that I have been referencing, is kind of also on the chopping block. And so if any of my work as an activist has taught me anything, it's that This issue enjoys bipartisan support, and when people get really loud about it, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle do get scared. So I think we have a very narrow window of time to make it very clear to our elected officials not to touch Tosca, because the other rollbacks that we've seen are egregious, to say the least, and will have dramatic impacts in a negative way for our health.
I think you mentioned earlier the way that the chemical industry began rolling out a lot of these products. They were targeting women. And I think women remain at the center of the chemical exposure and environmental movement. There's this idea of like the Maha Mom. But I think obviously you're leaving a lot of people out of your potential coalition. To make it an effective political bloc, you have to have men involved to some degree. How do you reach men around this issue? Like, do you change the narrative from it being like a green progressive fight to being about their biological sovereignty? How do you make men realize that this sort of corporate deregulation is the exact mechanism that's draining their testosterone?
I think it depends on the individuals. In the environmental health community, half of my colleagues were men. Like, I know there are a lot of men who really care about this issue. And in my experience, both lobbying male elected officials and who shows up to a lot of these community meetings and grassroots town halls that I've hosted over the years, I think there's the two unifying things that really upset everyone, but especially men. Number one is a direct threat to their fertility. So research around environmental exposures to chemicals in general population, not just in industrial and workplace settings, in male fertility and sperm count decline and sperm mobility is dramatic, and it is very alarming. It quickly shifts the narrative from this being a woman's issue to, oh shit, we're all in this together. I have found a lot of men are highly motivated, especially given the credibility of the science around impacts to these different important reproductive systems for men in particular. And the second thing is I have found men and is the idea that this is happening without our consent. And at the end of the day, we can make whatever choices we want. I can eat pizza 5 days a week. That's my choice. I get to make those dietary decisions. But people don't have the same option to say yes or no or to opt out of our exposure to these ubiquitous chemicals. And that kind of unfair treading on someone's independence and autonomy to be able to make choices, and knowing that you can't really solve this through consumer choices. You can't shop to have a perfect home that is going to prevent any of these exposures, really gets people upset, and rightfully it should. So I have found those are the two arguments that really resonate mostly with men. But it's interesting because I do think a lot of men care about this. And then you've got a noisy but small fringe that just kind of want to paint this as a woman's issue. And there's like a pettiness in the way that's delivered to kind of downplay this is like, oh, this is about mascara. This is about makeup. And it's really not. This is about human health. It's about our right to be able to choose whether it's to have reproductive systems that are operating the way that they were designed to, or having things like our breast milk not be contaminated.
Yeah, I read that post that you just put out on your newsletter about the new research showing that how much breast milk is carrying a lot of chemicals that obviously you don't want to be exposing your infant to. And yet, breast milk is supposed to be better for their immune system, better in so many different ways. And so I think a lot of people feel this sense of kind of paralysis.
Mhm.
That brings me to the question of individual action. Whenever we talk about solutions to toxic exposure, you talked earlier about the perfect house. And I think there's this real pressure in certain corners of, I don't want to say the environmental community, it's more like a consumer culture community, which is essentially like clean living, right? And your book is called Cleaning House. And I think you up on that, this idea of you have to buy glass containers, you have to swap out your laundry detergent, you have to check all the beauty labels. And obviously these are good practices, but at the same time, I think it's kind of an unfair burden to place on most parents and consumers or just anyone. Though, how do you kind of think about what are the reasonable things that each person can do as an individual to limit their exposure versus the kind of limits of voting with your wallet?
I think if you have the time and resources to participate in the clean economy, if you want to call it that, you should. And there are a lot of companies that are genuinely trying to transition away from the use of certain toxic chemicals. And they deserve our time and support because it's really hard to do. I know that firsthand, having formulated over 100 different products, both in the personal care and wellness side of things. With that being said, it is absolutely an unfair burden that we have placed on consumer shoulders to shop an incredibly complicated marketplace. And yes, I have some certifications that I think are credible and tools for people. But at the end of the day, the majority of people don't have the time, education, or income to be able to shop and bring products into their homes that are safer.
What do you feel like the road to, like, I guess, fixing? How do we move forward? Because the Trump administration right now is rolling back so many environmental regulations, PFAS testing in water. I believe that those rules were just rolled back. Various EPA regulations have been axed. So, at least for the next 2.5 years, things are looking grim. Imagine the goal is just to cling to whatever we've got and try not to lose ground. And then also, I guess, hopefully 2028, there's a new administration. What are the goals of the environmental health movement? And how are fixes or changes going to be made more durable, since we just witnessed how easily they can be rolled back or ignored?
Cleaning house, the title of my book is kind of a metaphor on multiple levels. Yes, it is about cleaning your home of certain toxic chemicals, but it's not a how-to guide. It's also about cleaning house of our elected officials and also the culture that I have seen around misinformation on both sides on social media. So I think the solutions lie in cleaning house in a few different ways. Yes, consumer choices matter, as we talked about. Where I am actually hopeful because we're coming up to the midterm elections, which is a very important election, because we have seen, especially with the rise of what are called Maha moms, but I've known them, it's conservative women who care about this issue. It just has a new brand. These women have been advocating for these laws alongside with me and others for decades now. If we can show that we can see through the PR spin that's coming out of the administration, and how it's in direct conflict with the actions and explicit rollbacks to the very issues that this base really cares about, we have the opportunity to really vote for elected officials who are willing to stand up for strong programs within the EPA and FDA to better regulate these toxic chemicals. I'm hopeful leading up to the election that if we're smart and we have enough people that are talking about these issues and kind of non-judgmental, but also kind of laying the facts out as they are, that could be an important turning point when it comes to at least stopping the proliferation of rollbacks. But I also think the biggest thing that we need to do, and part of the biggest part of the solution, is to really change how we consume information. So right now, people are getting the majority of their information from social media and specifically from influencers. And these I have found, whether it's wellness influencers that use fear mongering and overstate the science as a clear tactic. And then you've got these public health PhD, what I call the dismissers on the other side. They're like, oh, this is all fear mongering. Don't worry about this. This is all pseudoscience. Neither of those perspectives are reflective of the science, and they're not helpful because it just pits people against each other. And so my number one recommendation is for people to not get their information about toxic chemical pollution from social media. And instead, I drive people to credible sources like organizations that have been working on this for a really long time, who have PhDs on staff, and their entire job is to translate peer-reviewed science in a way that is credible and nuanced. If people can really make that shift and kind of go back to what it was like, 10 years ago, to really follow and trust a lot of these leading organizations that I list in my book and I reference in my Substack, I think we'll have hope. There'll be light at the end of the tunnel. And I think if there's anything that I've seen is that people are getting tired of this like online takedown culture and these culture wars. This is just a manifestation of an evolution of the mommy wars from 15 years ago, where people are just kind of doing these takedown posts on social media. And at the end of the day, you've got these amazing scientists who are not on social media because they're trying to defend their funding for this incredible research that they're producing. And those are the voices that we should really be listening to.
I think the problem, of course, is that most good scientists aren't great science communicators. And so you have a lot of people who are either well intentioned and misinformed or just like straight up grifters who fill that void and can make much snappier content than your average researcher can. And that's what people gravitate to. I think it's the job of people like yourself and myself to get into that space and be part of the discourse and try to shift the conversation in ways that are, based in evidence and reason and promote the public good as opposed to either individual profit kind of wellness grifts or just straight up rolling back the protections that keep us all safe. If you've enjoyed the show thus far and you think it's valuable or interesting, I would really encourage you to rate and review it or share it with somebody who you think would benefit from listening. The idea with the Just Keep Swimming miniseries is to think about the places where men might be uniquely invested in environmental outcomes and to kind of meet guys where they are, especially those who you might think of as being kind of Maha adjacent. So if you have a guy in your life who is worried about his sperm, regardless of his politics, maybe he'll be interested in Just Keep Swimming. That's the idea, at least. So yeah, please spread this message widely. I want to rewind, actually, because I realized we skipped a beat, which is we often treat climate change and toxic chemical exposure as two entirely separate crises. One's about global warming, the other's about human health. But in cleaning house, I think you do a good job of tying those two things together because these chemicals come from fossil fuels. As the world is transitioning from oil and gas to cleaner forms of energy, fossil fuel companies are betting on petrochemicals and plastics to sustain their profits. How does our reliance on plastic and synthetic chemicals tie into all of this? Because I think people don't think of these issues as being intertwined at all. And I think in the coalition around environmental health, there is still a fair amount of climate skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, the two are directly connected. Climate change and toxic chemical pollution are expressions of a singular problem, which is looking at petrochemicals and their impacts to human health and the environment, whether it be through climate change or through the products in our homes. The origins of the environmental health movement from the nonprofit side, the same organizations have been leading on toxic chemical pollution that have also been leading action on climate change. And so a small portion of individuals who care about and buy into the idea of addressing toxic chemicals in consumer products may also be climate skeptics. But the vast majority of individuals who support this can see the science behind the two as being equally compelling.
I think you may be understating the climate skepticism there because, like, as an example, the pipeline from vaccine skepticism to climate skepticism is very strong. So,
yeah,
and I think there are many vaccine skeptics who are also aligned with some of the ideas of the environmental health movement and could potentially be brought in. But it's like they have a lot of baggage.
That is a vocal group has a megaphone right now because of what's happening with RFK and with Trump. When you actually look at the grassroots base of people that care about these issues, who have been working on them and like calling their elected officials, I'm not talking about professionals, I'm talking about individuals, the origins and the kind of intersection, it's still a majority of, originally environmentalists who also care about climate change. So I'm not dismissing that there's a connection there or an issue at all. But that's why an issue that enjoys strong bipartisan support in today's world, especially, can get very messy. And this is getting messy. But at the end of the day, I think what we can do and what I try to do is like make this not partisan and depersonalize it and say, if we're going to look at the science around the links between lead and brain development or tobacco and lung impacts to our lungs and lung cancer, or toxic chemicals and our endocrine system, this same type of objective science is, even stronger on the climate change side. So at the end of the day, there's three really important ways that these two issues are connected. Number one, toxic chemicals are predominantly produced through the use of petrochemicals. And as you mentioned, the industry is really looking for ways to be able to still continue to be in business. And the boom of the plastics industry is their kind of biggest dollar signs that they see, and continuing to produce petrochemicals as well. The second is that the communities that are impacted the most, so fence line communities, those that live in communities that are facing climate impacts and also toxic chemical impacts, are all across the United States. They're communities that are living either next to chemical facilities or next to incinerators, who are then burning our trash, which then releases a different set of toxic compounds, including burning plastic, which happens a lot. So the social justice intersection is one of the things that is, again, a very strong connection with climate change. And then one of the kind of most alarming connections is that as we see the melting, especially of our polar ice caps and glaciers, we are finding that those ice have actually been storing some of these persistent chemicals, many of which are called POPs, and they're actually re-releasing these old, heavily toxic chemicals back into the environment. And again, that's where there's increased exposure to some of the communities I feature in my book, like indigenous Alaskan communities who rely, their traditional foods rely on things like blubber from marine mammals, which these chemicals are fat loving. So the layers of the connection between climate change and toxic chemical pollution are complicated and they're depressing. At the center of it, we need to talk about it more, because I think it is alarming. And I think if we think it's unjust to be saddled with the burden of trying to shop the market in this very complicated way, people are very upset by the burden that we've placed on communities who are trying to live in their traditional ways, far from any sort of chemical manufacturing.
I'm going to push back a little bit on this. Obviously, I care about climate. It's a big part of what I write about. But I think it's kind of a loser to put that front and center in a conversation around environmental health, because it is so low on the voters' list of most salient problems. And it has been successfully politicized by the right to become a shibboleth that you either believe in climate change or you don't believe in climate change. If you think it's a government hoax, anything that's connected to it becomes toxic by association. Even in the case of things like energy affordability, right? I kind of agree with the Democrats who are just talking about the price of energy and how it would be cheaper if we had more solar panels. And they're not talking about carbon emissions, because most people just don't care about carbon emissions. They care about their energy bill is going to be next month, in the same way that they care about whether or not their family is being poisoned. And that when we try to make these bigger arguments, which are true, I mean, 100%, like, these chemicals are made by fossil fuels, I don't think that it's rhetorically or politically compelling. Tell me I'm wrong.
I appreciate your push. I think you're right in a lot of ways. So like when I was kind of growing up professionally, I was working at environmental organizations, half my staff was working on climate change. The other smaller group of us was working on environmental health. I think the environmental movement fumbled the ball significantly on climate change. This is like generally speaking. And one of the things, those of us in the environmental health movement, we were like, you should be talking about air pollution and asthma, like things that people can connect to, human health as the center of it. And basically the entire movement made climate change about Keystone XL, like huge political miscalculation from the environmental movement. And what I will say though, and it's kind of like a lot of my work, it depends on which audience you're speaking to. I think different messages resonate with people. I've been working and organizing with mostly these women for decades now, and I never talk about climate change. I don't talk about these lightning rod issues, healthcare reform, taxes, abortion. You just don't go there and you focus on this as a unifying issue. So I think it depends on who you're talking to, but I do think it will be interesting to see with the new push for data centers to support our insatiable, rapid growing adoption of AI. We've got rural communities who are suddenly, oh, wait, whether it's the cost of electricity or the water resources that are being consumed in their community, or the air and noise pollution that are associated with these data centers is going to be another way to, whether we call it the fight against climate change, is all connected. And
Half
we've
of them
got
are
more
powered by
communities.
natural gas power plants as well, because it's faster to just get those up and running than try to connect anything to the grid.
Yeah, exactly. So you're having these multiple sources all within people's backyards. So I think it will be very interesting to see the evolution of this. And at the end of the day, the science is pretty clear on both of them and the solutions are different. But at the end of the day, human health is a very powerful lens when talking about and trying to get people to care about this enough, either to call their elected officials or think about how they're going to vote in the upcoming election.
Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. It was a pleasure speaking to you about cleaning house and all the work that you've been doing. I think it's really admirable. You've actually passed some laws. That's more than most people can say. And I hope that in the coming years, whether on the state level or on the federal level, that you can help pass some more laws to keep everyone a little bit healthier and safer.
We'll do it together because it takes everyone, including everyone who listens and reads your work, to care enough about this issue to carve 60 seconds in their day. So thank you for having me on.
Non-Toxic, as always, is hosted by me, Daniel Penny. The music is by Nathan Sharp, and the artwork is by Sam Creasy. I'll be back next week with at least one more episode of this Just Keep Swimming mini-series, and I've got some other exciting news coming on the horizon. I've got a big piece about my adventures at the Enhanced Games, which should be coming out in a few weeks from now, Voyager. And I'll be dropping an interview that I did with Brian Johnson while I was there, which I think many listeners of this show will find quite intriguing. If you'd like to support Non-Toxic, head on over to nontoxicpodcast.substack.com/subscribe and sign up to become a paying subscriber today. It's what helps me pay for the software that I use to cut this show together. It's what helps buy me coffee so that I have the energy to make this show. Please consider becoming a paid subscriber today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.